Well, are you sure it didn't happen before? You have no basis to ask that. No, it's not.
Some letters that were sent to Judge Lehman.
Blake Lively's brand new lawyer just made a huge mistake that could ruin her whole case. And yes, it was as bad as it sounds. When you get new lawyers in the middle of a big problem, sometimes they don't know which papers they shouldn't show in court. The poor guy walked in thinking he was helping Blake win, but instead he was about to cause a big explosion. The court meeting was supposed to talk about simple stuff before Blake's real trial started, but instead it showed the first crack in what now looks like a plan that's falling apart. And yesterday, right in the middle of the courtroom talk, Blake's main lawyer, David Michael Gotabel, stood up, packed his papers, and walked out. He didn't say why on the record, but court people later said he gave the judge a paper saying he had big moral problems with the case. He never came back. The trial didn't even stop. By the next morning, a new person was representing her. It was a backup lawyer from the same law office, someone who used to work under Gotabel as a helper. Even though he had the right qualifications, it was clear from the start that this new lawyer didn't know everything about the case, but the show had to keep going. He said hello, admitted the sudden change was weird, and tried to continue arguing for Blake's side. But then he said something that would cause the biggest anger yet. Because if there's one thing you don't do when walking into court during a crisis, it's to use a disgraced person as your good example.
They were the ones who kind of created this new Me Too law, and they wanted Judge Lehman to use it in Blake Lively's case, which is basically saying that if you are suing someone for SH, they're not allowed to sue you back for defamation.
While talking to Judge Lehman, the new lawyer talked about a bunch of letters sent to support Blake's case. He asked the court to think about what's called the new Me Too law. This is a controversial idea that says people who claim sexual harassment can't be sued back for lying. He asked the judge to officially think about all the support shown in these letters, calling them really important for understanding how people feel about helping victims.
LA Times did a big story on this, and they also mentioned the letter that was sent from an individual, a lawyer. Her name is Elise Dorsey, and LA Times was saying that a separate letter of interest was also filed by Elise Dorsey, a former federal employee.
He said the court had gotten letters from legal experts, advocacy groups, and famous people who survived workplace harassment. It sounded practiced. It might have even worked until one single name was mentioned, and just like that, one letter turned the whole courtroom against Blake's defense.
SH survivor described being sued for defamation after speaking out and said the law at issue could have spared her years-long legal ordeal.
A sexual harassment survivor who said she was sued for lying after speaking out and said this law could have saved her from years of legal trouble. As soon as Blake's defense mentioned a letter from Elise Dorsey, the whole room changed. Veldon's lawyers immediately asked a counter-question. Your Honor, are we supposed to understand that the defense is using the words of Miss Elise Dorsey? The judge, looking confused, asked the new lawyer to explain. The lawyer said yes, stating that Dorsey's letter showed real experience that matched the issues in this case. That's when Judge Lehman, looking very unimpressed, pushed back. Why, he asked, would a case built on being believable lean so heavily on a woman whose own case was publicly proven wrong and legally thrown out?
As he's claiming, the relationship was consensual, and he was showing a lot of text. There's a lot of text messages in the legal filings as well, where you can see their text back and forth.
Elise Dorsey, a former government worker, is no stranger to headlines. Her own legal fight, once called a landmark Me Too moment, fell apart after evidence showed she had an 11-year romantic relationship with a married professor. She later tried to say it was harassment instead. The professor sued her back for lying, and in the end, Dorsey had to settle the case and pay him money. That's public record. That's what happened before. And that's who Blake's lawyer decided to highlight in front of a federal judge. It's one thing to build a weak defense. It's another thing to hand the court the exact reason why it should fall apart. The judge asked if the defense had properly checked the sources of these letters before showing them as character testimony. The replacement lawyer stumbled for an answer, giving vague references to outside contributors and peer-reviewed submissions. But the damage was done. By bringing up a woman whose legal standing had already been taken away, the defense basically heard its own argument that Blake's accusers should be disqualified from suing back. In trying to protect Blake under the umbrella of survivor advocacy, they accidentally dragged her under the shadow of someone widely discredited. The courtroom was already tense from Blake Lively's lawyer walking out the day before, but no one could have expected what would happen next. As the replacement lawyer tried to take back control of the story, he reached for something that should have given him moral power: a stack of letters sent to Judge Lemon from various advocacy groups. With a confident voice but zero foresight, he highlighted one particular letter promoting the so-called new Me Too law, suggesting it be used as a guiding rule for the case. This idea, still unofficial and lacking legal precedent, argues that victims of sexual harassment should not be vulnerable to being sued back for lying, no matter how the claim turns out. But the problem wasn't just the law itself, it was the person behind it. That letter, which the defense held up as a symbol of survivor advocacy, came from none other than Elise Dorsey, a name that immediately caused whispers in the courtroom. The moment her name was spoken, the opposing lawyers from Justin Baldwin's team asked one devastating question: is the defense asking the court to consider the opinion of Elise Dorsey, whose case was publicly discredited and settled against her? Judge Lemon paused, clearly caught off guard by the reference, and turned to the defense. The new lawyer nodded, insisting Dorsey's voice reflected the broader experience of harassment victims. That was a miscalculation, a deadly one, because Dorsey isn't just a controversial figure, she's a legal warning story. Elise Dorsey, once presented as a whistleblowing federal employee, had claimed sexual harassment against a professor she had been in a relationship with. What wasn't initially publicized but later confirmed in court documents and investigative reports was that the relationship lasted over 11 years and was entirely consensual. Dorsey had even been married at the time, as was the professor. It was only after he ended things that she filed harassment charges. When those claims were challenged in court, not only did she fail to prove her case, but the professor's counter-lawsuit for lying led to a private settlement, one that required her to pay him. That's the voice Blake's team decided to amplify. So how does a defense collapse by choosing the loudest, least credible advocate in the room? Judge Lemon's mood shifted as he began questioning the defense's logic. He asked directly whether Blake's legal team had reviewed the outcome of Dorsey's case before using her letter as evidence. The lawyer tried to argue that the letter represented the broader struggle of victims regardless of technical rulings, but it didn't work. The courtroom could feel the temperature shift. If this was the best Blake's team had to offer, a failed legal figure pushing a non-existent law, then what else in their case was built on fantasy? You could almost see the weight of that question land on the judge's shoulders. Because once a federal judge starts suspecting you're playing fast and loose with legal truth, the benefit of the doubt dies on the spot.
Okay, so this YouTube channel called Cassidy O'Connell looked into the legal case from Elise Dorsey.
But the blow wasn't finished. The leaked file submitted earlier by mistake included not just the letter itself, but also a full expose compiled by independent journalist Cassidy O'Connell. Her investigation had already gone viral for its brutal takedown of Dorsey's claims. Court documents, text messages, and timelines were all laid out in devastating detail.
It's crazy! So this woman had a relationship to this professor for 11 years while she was also married. He was married and she was also married.
O'Connell had found flirty text messages from Dorsey sent during the very time period she later claimed to have been harassed. There were messages of love, jealousy, and even threats when the professor moved on. In one message, Dorsey allegedly said, "If you think you can just walk away from me, you're wrong." That's what Blake's team used as part of their moral foundation. What kind of defense builds a case on a blueprint that's already been torn to shreds in public and in court? The judge carefully reviewed the printed screenshots from O'Connell's report, reading aloud one of the more damning sections. She continued to show up at his workplace uninvited and emotional, demanding reconciliation and threatening exposure. The court sat in silence. No one on Blake's side interrupted. There was no objection, no denial, only a hollow attempt to shift focus back to the principle of advocacy, as the attorney phrased it. Yet even that seemed fake. Now, with each new detail, the believability of the entire strategy crumbled further, and the court knew it. If Blake Lively's defense is willing to elevate false victims to win in public, what else are they willing to bend behind closed doors?
Where you can see their texts back and forth. And after 11 years, when he actually wanted to end the relationship, she was not happy about it and she got jealous about it.
Then came the part no one could spin. Elise Dorsey lost her case and she paid to close it. That fact, read aloud in federal court, stripped away every pretense that her letter was written from a place of judicial validation. It wasn't. It was written from damage control. The new Me Too law, built on protecting voices like Dorsey's, now looked more like a loophole campaign for people who didn't win in court but still wanted to control the story. Judge Lemon asked, "Do you expect this court to accept a legal theory constructed by someone who was held accountable for lying under oath?" No one answered him, and that silence was the most honest moment Blake Lively's legal team had all day.
And ended up showing up at his campus and yelling at him. So after 11 years of a consensual relationship, she sued him for SH, and then he ended up suing her back for defamation. The lawsuit ended up being settled and she had to pay him.
The final blow came when the judge began questioning where the letter submissions came from. Who checked them? Who approved including them? Was Blake aware of who these people were? The responses were vague, too vague. And in the courtroom, vagueness doesn't signal caution. It signals hiding something. Lemon ended the discussion by stating he would formally reconsider whether to allow advocacy letters tied to disputed legal outcomes, a statement that stunned even the prosecution. If the court strikes those letters, Blake's moral defense vanishes entirely. Just when it seemed Blake Lively's legal team couldn't mess up the case any harder, the courtroom was handed another scandal. This one far outside the normal scope of depositions or motions. During Judge Lemon's continued review of the accidentally leaked documents, an entirely different file came to light. It was a printout of Reddit threads, fully saved and time-stamped, documenting Elise Dorsey's alleged online efforts to clean up her public image. According to the evidence, Dorsey had been systematically deleting critical comments on her LinkedIn profile and wiping mentions of her failed lawsuit from all accessible platforms. The threads were originally posted by anonymous legal hobbyists, or as the courtroom quickly began calling them, Reddit detectives. It's never a good sign when anonymous strangers on the internet are doing more research than your legal team. The document submission included screenshots of before and after comment sections, showing how entire chains of criticism vanished within hours of being posted. Many commenters had raised fair questions. Why had Dorsey continued to communicate flirtatiously with the man she later accused? Why were the settlement terms so carefully buried? Why was she now promoting legal reform built on a case she lost? Those comments disappeared one after another, and it didn't take long for users to begin calling her out for managing her online legacy. Once those claims were saved and shared across platforms, they made their way straight into court, not by intention, but by the incompetence of a defense attorney who had no idea what was inside the folder he handed over. And the worst part? The judge now had hard proof that this wasn't just about a weak letter. It was about someone actively rewriting their history. Judge Lemon paused as he read aloud the user comments, his voice steady but pointed. "This appears to be a pattern of story manipulation," he said. "Is the defense aware that the individual you've cited as a moral authority is simultaneously scrubbing public records of her legal loss?" The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The new lawyer mumbled something about irrelevant personal activity. But by that point, the air had already changed. This wasn't a courtroom drama anymore. It was beginning to look like a case study in deliberate misinformation. Because if Elise Dorsey was rewriting her digital past to maintain credibility, who's to say Blake Lively isn't doing the same thing on a much grander scale? That implication came quickly. As the Reddit files were being reviewed, someone in Belden's legal team quietly pointed out that the manipulation tactics attributed to Dorsey bore an uncanny resemblance to Blake's own PR behavior. The court had already seen footage of her June 2020 forecast dinner where she excluded Justin Baldoni and appeared in full paparazzi glam. That too had been staged, called in advance, and covered in flattering terms by media outlets she's known to collaborate with. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It was strategic orchestration from two women deeply invested in steering the public narrative. whether or not the facts supported it. And when the judge himself connects those dots out loud, the defense doesn't just lose the argument, it loses the room. What followed was the kind of moment every celebrity dreads in a courtroom, when a judge stops addressing legal points and starts commenting on character. There appears to be an effort, Lehman said, to manipulate not only the narrative of this case but the people shaping it. The remark landed like a gavel to the chest. The media seated in the gallery, previously quiet, began whispering. Murmurs spread across social platforms almost instantly. Hashtags started trending before the court even took a break. And just when it seemed things couldn't possibly spiral any further, another bomb dropped. This time tied directly to Blake's own inner circle. Because buried inside that same bundle of files was something far more devastating than a Reddit scandal: a contract. A scanned section of a recent legal agreement revealed that Blake Lively's law firm, Wilkie Farnan Gallagher, had entered into a $100 million deal with the Trump administration. Not just general counsel, not just external support, but a formal commitment to provide extensive legal services to the very political system Blake publicly opposes. Even more disturbing, the contract included a clause stating that the firm had agreed to suspend current diversity-based hiring policies as part of its reallocation of resources. The hypocrisy couldn't have been more obvious. This was a woman who frequently speaks out on LGBT+ rights, racial equity, reproductive justice, now represented by a firm cozying up to the exact forces dismantling those platforms. And you could tell by Blake's face, she knew the courtroom had just turned into a stage she couldn't direct. The judge didn't wait. He'd read aloud from the contract line by line, pausing only to raise an eyebrow at Blake's counsel. "This agreement," he said, "appears to contradict the public image your client has gone to great lengths to cultivate." At that moment, Blake looked down, her hands folded, her jaw set. There was no comeback, no smirk, no scripted response, just silence. A woman marketed as a beacon of modern feminism now sitting silently in court, while her legal team's ties to Trump and abandonment of diversity principles were exposed in front of the press, the judge, and the public. And outside the courthouse, it didn't take long for that hypocrisy to gain a name: a fraud in feminist clothing. Critics were ruthless. One activist tweeted, "So we're supposed to believe Blake Lively is fighting for justice while her lawyers are literally dismantling inclusion policies for power and money." The backlash was instant, cutting across both political lines and celebrity fandoms. Even formerly supportive outlets began to distance themselves, with one entertainment editor noting that Blake's credibility now faces a structural collapse. And make no mistake, that collapse wasn't happening behind closed doors. It was happening live and with receipts. The public had seen the contract, they had heard the judge's reaction, and most importantly, they could now draw a straight line between Blake's curated image and the machinery operating in her name. Because it's one thing to misstep privately, it's another to get caught publicly contradicting every value you claim to stand for. Back in the courtroom, Judge Lemon concluded the session with a pointed remark. "There's a difference between being misunderstood and being misrepresented. This court will be examining both. It wasn't just a warning, it was a statement of intent. The days of benefit of the doubt were over. Every piece of Blake's strategy would now be reviewed with the assumption that what looked like sincerity may well have been performance. The carefully constructed public persona, the celebrity-endorsed activism, the scripted apologies, all of it now under judicial review. And when your brand is built on the illusion of truth, how do you survive the moment someone starts reading the footnotes?" As the courtroom continued to digest the fallout from Blake Lively's legal blunders, the spotlight shifted to another unsettling piece of evidence: a collection of surveillance-style photographs tied to a cast dinner held on June 28, 2024. At first glance, the images could have been mistaken for typical Hollywood paparazzi shots. Blake arriving in full glam, smiling for flashing cameras as her castmates followed behind. But once examined in context, it became impossible to ignore what was missing from those images. Justin Baldoni, the director and co-star of the film, was conspicuously absent. Not accidentally, deliberately, because when the guest list excludes only one person and the cameras are already in place, that's not dinner, that's a setup. The photos weren't submitted voluntarily. They appeared buried in the same document leak that had already caused Blake's team so much damage. But once they were in the judge's hands, they couldn't be ignored. What made them particularly damning was the timestamp metadata included on the digital files, showing that the photographers had arrived on site nearly an hour before the first cast member entered the building. Judge Lemon raised the point himself. This appears to have been a staged media opportunity executed with the clear knowledge of who would be present and who would not. It didn't sound like a question. It sounded like an accusation, and when a federal judge accuses you of staging public humiliation for PR optics, you're no longer just on trial legally. You're on trial morally. The courtroom sat in silence as the judge reviewed excerpts from a People magazine article that had run the very next day, highlighting Blake's supposed celebration of cast unity after wrapping major production. The article described Blake as radiant, elegant, and graciously welcoming her co-stars to an intimate gathering. But nowhere did it mention Baldwin. He wasn't just excluded from the guest list, he was excluded from the narrative. Judge Lemon stared down the defense table and asked, was the court supposed to believe this wasn't intentional? The new attorney didn't answer because there's only so long you can spin a coincidence before it begins to look like a campaign. The prosecution quickly capitalized on the moment. Baldwin's counsel argued that the dinner wasn't just a party. It was a deliberate attempt to shape the public narrative around who held power on set. Paparazzi don't just appear. Publicists don't just forget to mention key names. The image of unity, carefully constructed and distributed to national outlets, was designed to erase Baldoni from the picture, both figuratively and literally. The courtroom was then shown footage from that night, with photographers clearly calling out cast names, but never once asking about Baldoni. They weren't confused, they were instructed. And suddenly the question wasn't whether Blake manipulated media coverage. It was how often she did it and who she chose to silence in the process. As the defense scrambled to redirect, Judge Lemon returned to the elephant in the room. Why had this set of media files been submitted to the court at all, buried among advocacy letters and unrelated exhibits? The defense attorney, still clearly out of his depth, mumbled something about media context and reputation framing, which only made things worse because the judge wasn't asking for spin. He was asking who made the decision to include these images and why the court wasn't told about them. His next question landed like a sledgehammer. Was the original legal team aware these materials would be discovered? And in federal court, breaches of trust don't go unanswered. They invite contempt charges. The word contempt wasn't spoken lightly, but it was mentioned twice. Judge Lemon warned the defense that if additional suppressed or misrepresented evidence surfaced, the court would be forced to take formal action. That includes the possibility of fines, disqualification of legal counsel, or sanctions against the client herself. The courtroom's energy shifted yet again, not just focused on legal survival, but legal exposure. Blake Lively was no longer defending her reputation. She was now defending her strategy, her team, and the very foundation of her case. And if you want to know how brutal her fall will be, don't forget to subscribe.